Yeah, so first of all, we'll have a look at the geometry on older frames, because the further you go back, the more different the geometry is to what a modern bike is. So if we look at like a 1950s bike, then it usually will have a longer wheelbase and the angles might be a bit slacker, and it's probably made for wider tyres as well, so it'll have more rake on the forks, that kind of thing. You know, a 1950s bike, you might find it's not really going to ride the same as a modern bike, so we'll probably try and skip 1950s, you know, when we're looking at this. Once you get into the 1960s, the geometry is starting to get like what we have today. So the angles will be similar, the wheelbase, the amount of clearance for the tyres is more similar to what we have now. And then once you get to 70s and 80s, it's pretty much exactly like a modern bike. And also on the older bikes, especially once you go back to the early sort of 1950s bikes and older than that, you're going to find that they might have a 26-inch wheel, or they might have a 27 1.25 wheel. You know, not as many will have will have been made for a 700 or sprints, as they were called at the time. So you've really got to look out for that. Once you get into the 1960s and 70s, you're pretty much going to be looking mostly at 700C, but some bikes will still have 27 1.25 if they're built for like touring rather than racing. Because people couldn't afford to have a lot of bikes, you know, they might specify a bike that had 27 1.25 wheels in it, and then they'd stick their racing wheels in as well. But the only problem with that is we'll find that the depth of the brakes that we need to fit is not going to really be compatible with a modern setup. Another thing is the dropouts on the back of the frame. Again, the further you go back, the more incompatible the dropouts will be. So first of all, they might not have a hanger on to fit a modern rear mech on, which is going to be a bit of a problem. And then the other thing is, you know, most modern bikes you're going to want a quick release wheel. Well, the older dropouts are much thinner, so there's not really enough room for the axle to stick through the dropout and clamp in the back of the bike. So again, you know, older 1950s bikes, you're going to have a problem there. Once you get again into the 1960s and 70s, they started using thicker dropouts. Usually there'd be something like a Campagnola dropout or something like that, and you'd be able to fit a modern derailleur on that, and you'd be able to fit quick release wheels. So that's really what you want to be looking for, to have like a Campagnola dropout on the back. So your next thing after that is probably going to be the depth of the brakes. So the brake calipers that we have nowadays, they usually span a range from 39mm to 49mm, and that's what we'd call close clearance, so you won't be able to fit a mudguard under them or anything. Then they do a mudguard length brake, which is 47 to 57mm drop, so that you can fit a mudguard under. But what you'll find is, with a lot of older bikes, they'll often need even deeper brakes than that. So again, if you get a very old bike that has deeper clearances, you're going to struggle to fit a modern brake on. So that's probably a frame to skip. Again, if you go back to the sort of 1950s bikes, they probably have what you call a side pull brake, which is basically what we use now. But the problem is that you're going to have the long deep clearance most of the time. Once we got into the 1960s, they started to use what they called a centre pull brake, where the cable pulled from the middle and there had to be a hanger on the frame. So you'll often find on a 60s frame, it'll have a little hanger for the brake cable, which is not needed if you want to fit a sort of modern brake. But the other thing with centre pull brakes is they'll usually again be made for deeper clearances. So again, 1960s frames, yeah, you still might be struggling really to fit a modern brake on those. But once you get to the 70s, they'll mostly be either the mudguard clearance drop or the close clearance racing drop, and you'll be able to fit the modern brake. But the next little issue you're going to run into is the fitting of the actual brake itself. So in the older days, the brakes just basically had a bolt going through the middle, and that went through the frame, and then there was a nut on the other side that you tightened the brake on with. Once we got into the 1980s, they started fitting what they call a concealed Allen key nut, and so that actually had a modification to the frame, so the little nut would fit in the frame, and that's how all modern brakes fit. So this is why really from the sort of mid 1980s you wouldn't have to usually do much modification to the frame to get those to fit, whereas anything earlier than that we'd have to modify it, which can be done, so it's no real big deal, but just something to look out for. Also, you may come across a frame that is meant for cantilever brakes, which are usually made for touring bikes, so again they're not really suitable if you wanted to fit a modern sort of racing group set on. Yeah, on the older bikes you'd often have a 26-inch wheel if you go right back to the 1950s and 1940s. After that they started to move on to a 27 1/4. You know, rarely you might find a 700 or sprint wheel in that bike. So you know, those older bikes are not really as suitable. But once you get into the sort of 60s and 70s, we're really moving on to mostly 700C, which will fit the modern wheels. But your next thing is the width of the back axle. From the sort of 1950s onwards, you know, 5-speed was really popular. So just a bit of bonus material for you here. So if you're looking at like a French frame, there are a few things you might really want to just know about, because French frames, they tend to have a different size tubing to nearly everything else. So they had a metric size down tube and a metric size top tube and a metric size seat tube. And you might think, well, what difference does that make? You know, lots of bikes have different size tubing. Well, the problem is that you won't be able to find a front derailleur that'll fit the seat tube, because it's a different size. You know, if there's ever any problem and one of the tubes needs replacing, say it's got a big dent in it or anything, we won't be able to do that now, because we just can't get hold of the tubing anymore. You know, Reynolds and who we get our tubing off don't supply those sizes now. You'll also find that the bottom bracket threads are a different size again, so you can't get a bottom bracket to fit, or at least there is very, very few bottom brackets out there. We do actually do one that we get from a company called Velo Orange, which will fit these older frames. And it's the same again once you start looking at the forks. They have a different thread on the column and a different column size. So you just need to be aware of these things. If you're looking at an old Peugeot or something like that, you know, it might not be that suitable for putting the new equipment on. Often the Peugeots also had a silly seat post size as well, which were much narrower than anybody else. So just something to look for. Yeah, so now we know what to look for in a frame and what era frame we want to get in order to do our conversion to modern components. In the next video, we're going to have a look at what pitfalls to look for when you're buying a frame, what damage you might find that you might want to avoid, and make sure that you don't buy a dud. So yeah, please watch us in the next video, and please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.